Between 1849 and 1852, 7 plantation overseers across eastern Alabama died with their skulls, crushed under impossible circumstances. Blunt force trauma, the physicians wrote, but the fracture patterns suggested something methodical. Compression, as if something massive had pressed downward until bone gave way. Each death occurred at plantations that had recently acquired an enslaved man, whose description appeared in ledgers with unusual specificity. 7 feet 2 inches tall, approximately 320 pounds, noted for exceptional strength. His name appeared simply as Greg, Gregory, or the Giant. The Alabama Planters Association knew someone was killing overseers and disappearing before anyone could establish a pattern, but they never organized a manhunt. They never offered a reward, because exposing Greg's story would reveal methods of control that made casual brutality look gentle by comparison. Before we continue, subscribe right now and drop your state or city in the comments. I want to know how far this story reaches. The arrival of something impossible. The steamboat Manifest from New Orleans, dated March 1847, lists among its cargo 1 male Negro, extraordinary dimensions, purchased from Delacroix estate liquidation. This single line, written in the careful script of a customs clerk who had no reason to imagine the significance of his documentation, represents the first confirmed appearance of Greg in Alabama records, though whispered stories suggest he had already lived several lifetimes' worth of horrors before that spring morning, when he was unloaded at the Mobile docks like furniture whose dimensions required special handling. The men who witnessed his arrival that day would later describe the moment with an almost superstitious dread. Not because of his size alone, though at over 7 feet tall, he towered above every man present, creating a shadow that seemed to possess weight and substance beyond normal shadow, but because of something in his bearing that defied every expectation they held about what an enslaved person should embody. There was no shuffling deference in his walk, no downcast submission in his posture, though neither was there open defiance that might justify immediate correction. He simply existed in a way that troubled the categories slave traders used to evaluate human merchandise. His hands drew particular attention. Witnesses described them as disproportionately large even for his massive frame, hands that could palm a man's head like holding an apple, fingers thick as axe handles but possessed of an unexpected delicacy when he was ordered to handle cargo during unloading. He could lift cotton bales that required 3 normal men to move, setting them down with a gentleness that suggested fine motor control existing alongside raw power. This combination disturbed the traders in ways they struggled to articulate, though one wrote in his private journal that watching Greg work made him think of a blacksmith's hammer that had learned to paint miniatures without surrendering its capacity for destruction. But it was Greg's eyes that truly unnerved those who looked directly at him, which most tried to avoid doing. They held a quality that slave traders recognized immediately as dangerous, though not in the way they were accustomed to managing. Not rage, which could be beaten out of a man with sufficient persistence. Not despair, which broke the spirit and made management simple. Not even the cunning defiance that marked troublemakers who required extra vigilance. Instead, Greg's eyes held something patient and calculating, a quality that suggested he was watching, remembering, waiting for something that only he could anticipate, as if time operated differently for him than for other men, as if he existed in a larger pattern that those around him could not perceive. The auction house in Mobile declined to handle his sale, citing vague concerns about facilities inadequate for his size. Instead, he was sold through private arrangement to Richard Thornton, a planter whose ambition exceeded his caution. The price negotiated was $2,400, a figure that reflected both Greg's obvious capacity for labor and the unspoken discount applied to property that made experienced slave traders nervous. Thornton took possession on March 19, 1847, leading Gregg to a wagon specially reinforced to handle his weight. The journey to Thornton's plantation took 2 days, during which Thornton would later report Gregg spoke only when directly addressed, answered questions with minimal words, and gave no indication of the violence that would end Thornton's life within 14 months. The body that defied medicine. Dr. Josiah Winters received a summons to Bellwood Plantation in April 1847, 1 month after Richard Thornton acquired Gregg. Thornton, a methodical man who documented his investments with careful attention to detail, wanted a medical assessment of his newest property, particularly given the extraordinary physical characteristics that had prompted concerns among more experienced slave traders. Dr. Winters arrived expecting a routine examination, the sort he had conducted hundreds of times on enslaved people whose bodies were evaluated like livestock for signs of disease, injury, or congenital weakness that might reduce their market value or work capacity. What Dr. Winters encountered instead disturbed his understanding of human anatomy in ways that his medical training had not prepared him to process. His private journal, discovered among his papers after his death in 1869, and now housed at the Alabama Historical Society, provides a detailed account of that examination. Gregg's skeletal structure, Dr. Winters noted, appeared sound despite proportions that, by all medical reasoning, should have caused debilitating joint problems. Men of unusual height typically suffered from weakened joints, curved spines, hearts unable to adequately supply blood to their extremities. Yet Gregg showed none of these expected pathologies. His heart, judged by pulse quality and chest resonance using the stethoscope that Dr. Winters had recently acquired from a medical supply house in Philadelphia, seemed robust enough to supply his massive frame with adequate circulation. His breathing showed no signs of the respiratory distress common in unusually large men. His joints, carefully palpated and manipulated through their full range of motion, demonstrated flexibility and strength that suggested they could bear his weight without the premature deterioration Dr. Winters anticipated finding. The physician wrote with barely concealed wonder about the sheer improbability of a body this size functioning with such apparent efficiency. But it was Gregg's hands that disturbed Dr. Winters most profoundly, enough that he devoted 3 full pages of journal entries to describing them. The hands measured 14 inches from wrist to the tip of the middle finger, with a palm width of nearly 7 inches. Dr. Winters, compelled by scientific curiosity that overcame his usual professional detachment, asked Gregg to pick up various objects in the examination room. A porcelain cup disappeared entirely within Gregg's closed fist. A leather-bound medical text could be held comfortably in one palm, fingers curling around it with casual ease. Dr. Winters then requested that Gregg demonstrate his grip strength on a pine board 2 inches thick. Gregg complied without apparent effort, his fingers pressing into the wood and leaving permanent indentations where normal human hands would have found the surface immovably resistant. The physician then produced a pumpkin from Thornton's kitchen garden, asking Gregg to compress it between his palms. What followed took perhaps 5 seconds, the pumpkin's hard outer shell resisting briefly before collapsing, the internal structure liquefying, seeds and pulp emerging between Gregg's fingers while his face showed no strain, no indication that the task required concentration or exertion. Dr. Winters wrote that evening with remarkable and chilling prescience. These hands possess both the delicacy to perform fine manual tasks and the strength to crush a human skull as easily as one might crack an eggshell. The observation was clinical, meant as purely medical documentation. But reading those words now, knowing what followed, they carry the weight of prophecy delivered by a man who understood the instrument, but could not foresee the symphony of violence it would eventually perform. The masters who could not see. Richard Thornton purchased Gregg for $2,400 in March 1847, a sum that represented the liquidation of 3 years of careful savings, combined with a substantial loan from a Montgomery bank that viewed the investment as sound given proper management. Thornton was not a wealthy planter by Alabama standards. His estate, Bellwood, comprised only 600 acres and 18 enslaved people before Greg's acquisition, producing modest cotton yields that kept Thornton comfortable, but not prosperous. The purchase of Greg represented a calculated gamble, a bet that a single man of unusual size and strength could do the work of 3 normal field hands, thereby increasing Bellwood's productivity without the expense of purchasing multiple workers. Thornton's financial calculations proved sound on paper. Greg could indeed perform labor that would normally require multiple men. He could clear stumps that might occupy a team of workers for days. He could lift loads that required specialized equipment on other plantations. He could work longer hours with less apparent fatigue than any man Thornton had previously owned. Within 6 months, Bellwood's cotton yields had increased by 32%, a figure Thornton documented in his plantation ledger with obvious satisfaction. The investment appeared to be paying dividends that would, within 2 years, cover the initial purchase price and begin generating pure profit. What Thornton never calculated, what none of Greg's subsequent owners would successfully calculate, was the impossibility of truly containing a mind that operated inside a body that powerful. They looked at Greg and saw muscle, saw labor capacity, saw financial potential measured in bales of cotton and bushels of corn. They assumed that because Greg spoke little, he thought little. Because he followed instructions without apparent resistance, they believed he had accepted his condition, internalized his enslavement, recognized his place in the natural hierarchy they believed governed relations between white owners and black property. This fundamental misunderstanding of silence as consent rather than strategy, of compliance as submission rather than patience, would prove fatal to Richard Thornton and every man who believed he owned Greg's obedience along with his labor. They mistook Greg's quiet observation for stupidity, his measured responses for limited intelligence, his controlled demeanor for broken spirit. They never considered that a man forced to perform labor under threat of violence might be watching, learning, identifying vulnerabilities in the system designed to contain him. They never imagined that patience could be a weapon more dangerous than rage, that calculation could be more deadly than open rebellion. The enslaved community at Bellwood understood what Thornton could not perceive. They recognized in Greg's careful silence the same quality that marked others who had survived multiple owners, multiple beatings, multiple sales that separated them from everyone they loved. It was the silence of assessment, of a mind that never stopped analyzing the structures of power that governed plantation life. The other enslaved people gave Greg respectful distance, not from fear of his size, but from recognition of something in him that suggested he was waiting for a moment that only he could identify, preparing for an action that only he had planned. Thornton died on May 7, 1848, his skull crushed in his locked study, his body discovered by his wife in the morning. Greg was questioned extensively, his alibi verified by multiple witnesses. Thornton's death was ruled misadventure. The plantation was liquidated, and Greg was sold again to another owner who believed he could succeed where Thornton had mysteriously failed. The architecture of control plantation owners across the antebellum South had developed elaborate systems for breaking the will of enslaved people, techniques refined over generations and shared through correspondence between planters who viewed enslaved labor management as both economic necessity and social science. The tools of this control were well established by the 1840s. The whip, applied with calculated frequency to remind enslaved people of their powerlessness. The separation of families used to demonstrate that no bond was sacred when it conflicted with an owner's economic interests. The denial of literacy, ensuring that enslaved people could not access the documents and communications that might facilitate escape or rebellion. The careful management of food, clothing, and shelter at levels sufficient to maintain work capacity, but inadequate to provide comfort or security. But Greg's size and strength required innovation beyond these standard methods. The punishment cells used to confine rebellious enslaved people on most plantations could not contain him. A room designed to hold a man of normal proportions became merely uncomfortable rather than impossible for someone of Greg's dimensions. The standard whip, wielded by an overseer of average build, could mark Greg's skin but seemed psychologically inadequate for conveying the message of total domination that plantation discipline was meant to establish. Even the threat of sale to the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana, which terrified most enslaved people into compliance, seemed insufficient deterrent for a man who had already been sold multiple times, and whose size made him valuable enough that no owner would casually destroy such expensive property. So owners developed specialized techniques for controlling enslaved people of unusual physical power, methods that emphasize psychological degradation over physical punishment. These techniques appear in private correspondence between planters during the late 1840s, letters that read like technical manuals for breaking human spirits. Richard Thornton, in a letter to a fellow planter dated June 1847, described his innovation of forcing Greg to work with tools sized for normal men, creating constant frustration and inefficiency that reminded Greg his body was wrong, excessive, a problem requiring correction, rather than an asset to be valued. Harold Wixworth, who would purchase Greg after Thornton's death, took this philosophy further. His journals describe a systematic program of what he called proportion correction. Greg was required to sleep in a cabin with a doorway deliberately built low enough that he had to crawl to enter and exit, performing this physical submission multiple times daily. He was assigned to work in the equipment shed, a structure with ceiling beams that hung so low Greg could not stand upright, forcing him to remain bent or crouched throughout his tasks. He was given clothing cut for men of normal height, the sleeves ending halfway up his forearms, the pant legs exposing his calves, creating a visual absurdity that was precisely the point. The psychological message embedded in these methods was consistent. Your body is aberrant. Your size is not strength but deformity. You must be made to fit into spaces designed for normal men, even if that requires you to fold yourself into painful configurations. The goal was not merely obedience, but internalized shame. The creation of a psychological state where Greg would see himself as his owners saw him, as property whose only value was labor and whose physical characteristics were problems, requiring constant management, rather than attributes that might confer power or advantage. What these plantation owners never considered was that their elaborate architecture of control might produce not submission, but education. Every technique designed to humiliate Greg also taught him about his owner's fears, their vulnerabilities, the specific anxieties that motivated their innovations in cruelty. He was learning exactly what terrified them most about his existence. And that knowledge, accumulated silently over months and years, would eventually become the foundation for a resistance none of them anticipated or survived. The first owner and the locked room. Richard Thornton's plantation, Bellwood, stood 12 miles north of Montgomery, along a road that wound through pine forest and red clay fields that produced cotton of adequate but not exceptional quality. The main house was a modest structure by plantation standards, 2 stories of whitewashed wood with a columned portico that suggested aspirations toward grandeur that Thornton's finances could not quite support. Behind the main house spread the typical constellation of plantation outbuildings, the kitchen, the smokehouse, the equipment sheds, the cabins where enslaved people lived in conditions that ranged from barely adequate to deliberately punishing, depending on their perceived usefulness and obedience. Among these outbuildings, Thornton constructed in the summer of 1847 what he called his correction facility, a structure whose purpose and design he described in letters to fellow planters with obvious pride in his innovation. The building measured 8 feet square, built of solid pine logs, with a door reinforced by iron bars and a lock mechanism imported from a Philadelphia manufacturer that specialized in prison hardware. But the structure's most distinctive feature was its ceiling, deliberately built at exactly 6 feet in height, a measurement chosen with Greg specifically in mind. When Greg required discipline, which in Thornton's methodology meant any instance of perceived slowness in following instructions or insufficient deference in his manner of address, he was confined to this space for periods ranging from 6 hours to 3 full days. The mathematics of the punishment were precise. Greg stood 7 feet and 2 inches tall. The ceiling hung at 6 feet. The resulting 14-inch discrepancy meant Greg could not stand upright. He could not sit comfortably with his back against the wall. He could not lie flat. Any position he adopted created sustained muscle strain. The larger muscle groups of his legs and back and neck forced to maintain tension that would become increasingly painful as hours accumulated into days. Thornton considered this innovation humane compared to whipping, a perspective that his wife Margaret initially shared. There were no visible scars from this punishment, no broken skin that might become infected and reduce Greg's value or work capacity. The discipline was entirely psychological and physiological, teaching the lesson of submission without the crude violence that Thornton associated with less sophisticated plantation management. He wrote to his brother in Virginia that he had discovered a method for correcting an oversized Negro that avoided physical damage while still providing necessary instruction in obedience and proper respect for white authority. Margaret Thornton supported her husband's methodology until the morning of May 7, 1848, when she descended from the bedroom at her usual hour and noticed that Richard had not yet emerged from his study, where he typically spent his early morning hours reviewing plantation accounts and correspondence before breakfast. She knocked at the study door and received no response. She tried the handle and found the door locked from inside, which was not unusual. Richard often secured the study when working with financial documents or writing letters he considered confidential. But something in the quality of the silence behind that locked door troubled her in ways she could not immediately articulate. She called for Joshua, an enslaved house servant, and instructed him to fetch the overseer. Together they broke down the study door, the lock splintering from the frame, the door swinging open to reveal a scene that would haunt Margaret Thornton for the remaining 34 years of her life. Her husband sat in his desk chair, his upper body slumped forward onto the desk surface, his head compressed in a way that suggested something impossibly heavy had been placed upon his skull and pressed downward with methodical force until the bone structure collapsed. His face had been driven into the wood of the desk, features flattened and distorted beyond recognition. Blood had pooled around his head and soaked into the papers scattered across the desk surface, account ledgers and letters now ruined by bodily fluids that continued to seep into the expensive paper stock Richard had imported from Charleston, specifically for his business correspondence. The door had been locked from inside. The windows remained fastened, their locks undisturbed. No weapon could be found that explained the trauma. And Greg, when questioned, had spent the entire previous evening and night locked in the equipment barn under guard, his location verified by 2 separate overseers who would testify that he never left their sight. The investigation that revealed nothing. Sheriff William Drummond arrived at Bellwood Plantation on the afternoon of May 7, 1848, summoned by a rider who had galloped into Montgomery with news of Richard Thornton's death. Drummond was a veteran lawman who had investigated dozens of deaths across the county, most of them uncomplicated instances of disease, accident, or the occasional violent altercation that resolved itself quickly once witness testimony established clear facts. He expected Thornton's death to follow familiar patterns, perhaps a riding accident or heart failure, or one of the dozen mundane catastrophes that claimed plantation owners with predictable regularity. What Sheriff Drummond found instead defied every category of death he had previously encountered. Richard Thornton's body remained in his study, untouched on Margaret Thornton's insistence that nothing be disturbed before proper investigation. The sheriff examined the scene with methodical attention, noting details that accumulated into an impossible picture. The study door had been locked from the inside, the key still turned in the mechanism when the door was broken down. The windows remained fastened, their locks showing no signs of tampering or forced entry. The room contained no weapon, no heavy object that might explain the crushing trauma that had compressed Thornton's skull. The nature of the injury particularly troubled Drummond. The force required to produce such damage would necessitate either a fall from significant height or impact with machinery capable of generating massive compression. Yet Thornton had been seated at his desk, the chair positioned normally, no evidence of disturbance suggesting he had fallen or been struck. The wound pattern indicated pressure applied from directly above, as if something impossibly heavy had been placed on Thornton's head and pressed downward with sustained force until bone gave way. Sheriff Drummond questioned every enslaved person on Bellwood Plantation, a process that consumed the remainder of that day and extended into the evening. Each person's location during the previous night was documented, alibis cross-referenced, movements verified by multiple witnesses. The enslaved community lived under constant surveillance, their activities known and tracked by overseers whose livelihoods depended on maintaining awareness of every person's whereabouts. This system of control, designed to prevent escape or rebellion, now provided ironclad verification that no one from the enslaved quarters had approached the main house during the hours when Thornton died. Greg received particular scrutiny given his size and strength, but his alibi proved unshakable. 2 overseers testified under oath that Greg had been locked in the equipment barn from sunset until dawn, secured there as punishment for what Thornton had deemed insufficient deference earlier that day. Both men had maintained watch throughout the night, rotating shifts, neither leaving their post. Greg had not left the barn. He could not have entered the main house, climbed to the 2nd floor, entered a locked study, killed Thornton, and returned to the barn without these guards noticing his absence. Sheriff Drummond's official report concluded that Richard Thornton died of misadventure, possibly a seizure that caused him to strike his head repeatedly against his desk with sufficient force to produce the observed injuries. The medical examiner, Dr. Josiah Winters, signed the death certificate without objection, though he noted privately that no seizure he had encountered in 20 years of medical practice could generate force adequate to compress human skull bone. The investigation closed. Thornton was buried, and no one officially questioned how a man alone in a locked room had died as though crushed by something that left no trace of its presence. The auction and the second chance. Bellwood Plantation was liquidated in June 1848 to settle Richard Thornton's debts, which proved more extensive than his widow had realized. The estate sale attracted buyers from across central Alabama, planters seeking bargains from a widow's distress and creditors eager to recover what they could from Thornton's assets. The enslaved people of Bellwood stood on the auction platform in Montgomery's main square, each person assessed and sold like livestock. Families divided based on economic calculations that acknowledged no human bond as sacred when it conflicted with maximum profit. Greg found himself on the auction block on a humid afternoon, standing in the center of a crowd whose attention he commanded through sheer physical presence. The auctioneer, a professional named Henry Caldwell who had conducted thousands of slave sales, struggled to find language adequate to describe what potential buyers were seeing. 7 feet and 2 inches of Negro male, Caldwell announced, strong as 3 normal men, experienced in field work, no history of running or rebellion. The auctioneer did not mention the mysterious circumstances of Thornton's death, though whispers circulated through the crowd, speculation passing from buyer to buyer about whether this extraordinarily large enslaved man had played some role in his owner's demise. The bidding opened at $1,800 and climbed quickly, despite the whispered concerns. Harold Wicksworth, owner of Ironwood Plantation 15 miles east of Montgomery, saw in Gregg exactly what Thornton had seen: labor capacity that could transform his operation's productivity. Wicksworth bid aggressively, driving the price upward against two competing buyers until he secured Gregg for $2,800, a sum that represented both Gregg's obvious value and Wicksworth's confidence that proper management would prevent whatever misfortune had befallen Thornton. Harold Wicksworth was 43 years old, a methodical man who believed in scientific agriculture and systematic labor management. He subscribed to periodicals from agricultural colleges, corresponded with plantation owners across the South about innovations in cotton cultivation, and maintained detailed records of every aspect of Ironwood's operations. His library contained the latest treatises on plantation efficiency, including several volumes specifically addressing the management of difficult enslaved people. He had consulted with overseers who claimed expertise in handling the physically powerful, men who assured him that proper technique could control any enslaved person, regardless of size or strength. Wicksworth felt confident he could extract maximum productivity from Gregg while avoiding the unnamed mistakes that had somehow resulted in Thornton's death. He had analyzed what little information was available about Thornton's management style and identified what he considered fundamental errors. Thornton had been inconsistent in his discipline, alternating between leniency and harsh punishment without clear system. He had failed to maintain adequate surveillance, allowing Gregg periods of unsupervised time. He had not employed sufficient psychological controls to reinforce the power dynamic between owner and property. These mistakes, Wicksworth believed, were correctable through superior methodology. As he led Gregg from the auction platform to the reinforced wagon that would transport him to Ironwood Plantation, Wicksworth felt the satisfaction of a man who had acquired valuable property at reasonable price and who possessed the knowledge necessary to manage that property successfully. He did not notice the quality in Gregg's eyes that had troubled the slave traders in Mobile. He did not perceive the patient calculation that marked Gregg's silence. He saw only muscle and labor and profit waiting to be extracted through proper application of scientific management principles that would, within 16 months, prove as inadequate as Thornton's cruder methods had been. The Science of Breaking Giants. Harold Wicksworth's journals, preserved by his descendants and made available to researchers in 2003, provide extraordinary documentation of his systematic approach to managing Gregg. The journals span from June 1848, when Wicksworth acquired Gregg at auction, through September 1849, ending abruptly 3 weeks before Wicksworth's death. They reveal a mind that approached enslaved labor management as engineering problem, something solvable through proper analysis and application of rational principles. Wicksworth believed that previous owners had failed with Gregg not because controlling him was impossible, but because they had employed insufficient methodology. Rather than the isolation and confinement that Thornton had favored, Wicksworth instituted constant surveillance as his primary control mechanism. Gregg was never alone, never unobserved. In the fields, an overseer maintained visual contact at all times. In his cabin at night, guards performed checks every 2 hours, opening the door to verify Gregg's presence and position. Even during the brief period each morning when enslaved people were permitted to prepare their own meals before work began, Gregg remained under watch by rotating observers who documented his activities in logs that Wicksworth reviewed each evening. This surveillance served dual purpose. It provided security against whatever violent potential Wicksworth suspected Gregg possessed, but it also created psychological pressure. The constant awareness of being watched, designed to reinforce Gregg's status as property rather than person, something owned so completely that even his private moments belonged to someone else. Wicksworth wrote in his journal that a Negro of unusual size must be reminded constantly that his physical advantages are irrelevant against the total system of white control, and that this reminder is most effectively delivered through unceasing observation. Wicksworth also carefully calibrated Gregg's diet to maintain strength for work, while avoiding excess calories that might increase physical power beyond what labor required. Each meal was measured and documented. Greg received adequate nutrition to sustain his size and work capacity, but nothing extra. No opportunity to build additional muscle that might translate into threat. The portions were calculated based on formulas Wixworth had developed through consultation with a physician who specialized in what was then called Negro physiology, pseudo-scientific racism dressed in medical terminology. Most significantly, Wixworth instituted what he termed proportion correction, a systematic program designed to wage constant war against Greg's physical reality. Greg was required to use tools sized for normal men, creating perpetual frustration and inefficiency. Axes with handles too short for his reach, hoes that forced him to bend awkwardly, cotton sacks that filled before he could properly utilize his carrying capacity. He was assigned to workspaces designed for smaller bodies, the equipment shed with its low ceiling, the tobacco barn with doorways that required him to duck and turn sideways. His cabin was rebuilt to Wixworth's specifications, the doorframe deliberately constructed at 5 feet 6 inches, forcing Greg to crawl on hands and knees to enter or exit his own living space. This physical submission, performed multiple times daily under the observation of guards who documented each instance, was precisely calibrated humiliation. The message was clear and constant. Your body is wrong, excessive, a problem requiring correction. You must make yourself smaller, fold yourself into spaces designed for normal men. Accept that your physical characteristics are not advantages but aberrations requiring management and control. The overseer, named Crutchfield, James Crutchfield, served as Harold Wixworth's head overseer, a position he had held for 6 years before Greg's arrival at Ironwood Plantation. Crutchfield was 34 years old, 5 feet 7 inches tall, weighing perhaps 160 pounds. A man of distinctly average physical dimensions whose authority derived entirely from the structural violence he was empowered to inflict. He carried a whip and a pistol, symbols of the power that plantation society granted to white men regardless of their individual physical capabilities. That power allowed Crutchfield to dominate enslaved people of far greater size and strength, maintaining control through the understood reality that resistance would bring overwhelming retaliatory force. But Greg's arrival troubled the mathematics of domination that Crutchfield had always relied upon. Here was an enslaved man who could, in simple physical terms, overpower Crutchfield with minimal effort. The whip would hurt Greg, certainly, but would it provide sufficient deterrent to someone whose body could absorb damage that would incapacitate normal men? The pistol remained effective, but it required distance and reaction time, advantages that might evaporate if Greg moved with the speed his size suggested he was capable of generating. Crutchfield seemed to take Greg's existence as personal challenge, an affront to the natural order that required constant reassertion of proper hierarchy. He developed what the enslaved community at Ironwood recognized as obsession, a fixation on Greg that went beyond normal overseer vigilance into something darker and more psychologically complex. Crutchfield appeared unable to tolerate any moment when Greg's size might be interpreted as advantage, any instance when Greg's physical reality might suggest power rather than aberration requiring correction. The overseer devised increasingly creative humiliations, rituals of degradation performed with medical precision to wound psychologically, while leaving no marks that might reduce Greg's market value. He required Greg to kneel when receiving instructions, a position that eliminated the height differential and forced Greg to look upward at Crutchfield's face. He insisted that Greg address even the youngest white children on the plantation as master or miss, regardless of their age or status. He created arbitrary rules specific to Greg, prohibitions that applied to no other enslaved person, regulations designed solely to create opportunities for correction and punishment. Most significantly, Crutchfield required Greg to move through Ironwood Plantation in a perpetual crouch, bent forward at the waist so that his height appeared diminished to something closer to normal human proportions. This posture had to be maintained whenever Greg was in sight of the main house, or whenever white people were present. The physical strain of sustaining this position for hours created constant discomfort, without leaving visible injury, exactly the effect Crutchfield intended. The message was performed publicly, demonstrated to the entire enslaved community. This man's size means nothing, his strength is irrelevant. He can be made small through nothing more than the command of a white overseer half his size. The enslaved community at Ironwood watched these humiliations with a dread that went beyond sympathy for Greg's suffering. They recognized in Crutchfield's obsession the dangerous psychology of white men whose authority depended on the absolute degradation of black humanity. They understood that Crutchfield's escalating creativity in devising new humiliations suggested he was searching for the breaking point, the moment when Greg would either submit completely or resist and provide justification for the extreme violence that Crutchfield seemed increasingly eager to deploy. They watched and waited, knowing that whatever came next would be terrible for everyone at Ironwood, knowing that the collision between Crutchfield's obsession and Greg's patience could only end in catastrophe. The night of careful planning. On September 14, 1849, Harold Wicksworth retired to his bedroom at his customary hour of 9 in the evening, a routine he maintained with such regularity that the entire household operated according to its rhythms. His wife occupied a separate bedroom adjacent to his, connected by a door that remained open during sleeping hours, as was common practice among married couples of their class and era. The household staff completed their evening duties and withdrew to their quarters. The guards assigned to watch Greg verified his presence in his cabin and assumed their posts outside. The plantation settled into the silence that descended each night when labor ceased and enslaved people returned to whatever rest their exhaustion permitted. Harold Wicksworth died sometime between midnight and dawn. The physician who examined his body the following morning found massive skull fractures consistent with crushing force applied from directly above. Yet Wicksworth's bedroom showed no signs of struggle, no indication that anyone had entered or left through normal means. The door to his room remained locked from inside, the key still in place. The windows were fastened, their locks undisturbed. His wife, sleeping in the adjacent bedroom with the connecting door open, had heard nothing throughout the night, no sounds of struggle or distress, no indication that anything unusual was occurring mere feet from where she slept. The guards assigned to watch Greg testified under oath that he had never left his cabin during the night. They had performed checks every 2 hours as required by Wicksworth's protocols, opening the cabin door and observing Greg's position inside. At midnight, 2 in the morning, and 4 in the morning, Greg had been precisely where he was supposed to be, apparently sleeping, showing no signs of having moved or attempted to leave. The guards were adamant and consistent in their testimony. They had not fallen asleep at their posts. They had not left their positions. Greg had not passed them. The physical impossibility of Greg leaving his guarded cabin, traveling to the main house, entering a locked bedroom, killing Wicksworth, and returning undetected was absolute. Yet the manner of Wicksworth's death precisely matched the pattern that had killed Richard Thornton 16 months earlier. The same crushing trauma to the skull. The same locked room impossible to enter or exit without leaving trace. The same absence of weapon or explanation. Sheriff Drummond, now investigating his second such death connected to Greg's ownership, documented these similarities in his report, but could find no theory that explained the evidence. The laws of physical reality seemed to preclude Greg's involvement, yet every instinct insisted he was responsible. The investigation expanded to consider other possibilities. Had someone else killed Wicksworth using methods that mimicked the trauma pattern from Thornton's death? But who would benefit from such murder, And how would they know the specific details of Thornton's wounds? Were the two deaths merely coincidental, tragic accidents that resembled each other due to chance? But the statistical probability of two men dying in identical circumstances within 16 months of each other, both men having owned the same enslaved person, stretched coincidence beyond rational acceptance. The enslaved community at Ironwood maintained absolute silence regarding their observations or suspicions. When questioned, they provided alibis that corroborated each other, creating an impenetrable network of testimony that placed every person at the plantation in locations where they could not have accessed Wicksworth's bedroom. They answered questions with minimal words, offered no speculation, volunteered nothing beyond what direct questions required. Their collective silence suggested knowledge they chose not to share, but silence was not evidence. And Sheriff Drummond possessed no legal means to compel testimony beyond what they chose to provide. The investigation concluded with the same unsatisfying verdict that had closed the Thornton case. Death by misadventure, cause unknown. No evidence supporting criminal charges. The overseer's sudden departure. 3 weeks after Harold Wicksworth's death, James Crutchfield resigned his position as head overseer at Ironwood Plantation, a decision that shocked the enslaved community and puzzled Margaret Wicksworth, who had assumed Crutchfield would help manage the estate during the transition period following her husband's demise. Crutchfield had served the plantation for 6 years with ruthless efficiency, his reputation for maintaining discipline through psychological intimidation, making him valuable to plantation owners who valued order above all other considerations. His departure, sudden and without proper notice, violated both professional custom and his contractual obligations. But Crutchfield seemed compelled by terror that overwhelmed practical considerations. In his final days at Ironwood, enslaved people who observed him noted the transformation of a man who had previously moved through the plantation with absolute confidence in his authority. He stopped sleeping, his eyes acquiring the red-rimmed exhaustion of someone who feared what might visit him in darkness. He jumped at shadows and unexpected sounds, his hand constantly moving to the pistol he now kept loaded and within reach at all times. He began keeping multiple firearms in his quarters, arranging them around his bed like protective talismans against something he would not name. Margaret Wicksworth, concerned about Crutchfield's increasingly erratic behavior, asked him directly what troubled him. Crutchfield refused to explain, offering only that he had urgent family business in Texas that required immediate attention. When pressed, he became agitated, insisting he needed to leave Alabama as quickly as possible. Before departing, he made Margaret promise that Greg would be sold immediately, refusing to remain at Ironwood even temporarily if Greg stayed on the property. On his final morning at the plantation, Crutchfield burned his personal papers in a bonfire that consumed 6 years of records, journals, and correspondence. Enslaved people who witnessed this destruction noted that Crutchfield stood before the flames with an expression that suggested relief mixed with lingering dread, as if destroying written evidence might somehow protect him from something he had witnessed or understood. He left Ironwood that afternoon with 2 packed trunks, boarding a coach to Mobile where he would catch a steamboat to Texas. The enslaved community discussed Crutchfield's departure in careful whispers, speculation passing between them about what the overseer had realized or seen that drove him to abandon a secure position and flee Alabama entirely. Some suggested he had witnessed something the night Wicksworth died, some violation of natural law that shattered his understanding of what was possible. Others believed Crutchfield had simply recognized the pattern that authorities refused to acknowledge, understanding that remaining near Greg meant courting the same fate that had claimed 2 plantation owners. Whatever knowledge Crutchfield possessed, he carried it to Texas and guarded it until his death in 1857 from cholera. His widow, sorting through his possessions after his burial, found no journals, no letters, no documents explaining why he had left Alabama so abruptly. In the years before his death, Crutchfield had occasionally been heard to mutter about things man was not meant to understand, about the impossibility of locked rooms, about hands large enough to palm a human skull. But he never provided coherent explanation, never testified about what he suspected or witnessed, taking his terror to the grave, along with whatever truth he had glimpsed in those final weeks at Ironwood Plantation. The pattern, invisible to power. By the winter of 1850, 3 plantation owners who had purchased Gregg were dead under circumstances that shared unmistakable similarities. Richard Thornton in May 1848, his skull crushed in his locked study. Harold Wicksworth in September 1849, killed identically in his locked bedroom. And Thomas Brennan, who had purchased Gregg from Wicksworth's estate in November 1849, found dead in August 1850 with the same crushing skull trauma, the same impossibility of entry or exit, the same absolute lack of evidence suggesting how the murder had been accomplished. Yet no formal investigation connected these deaths into recognizable pattern. Each case was examined in isolation, local sheriffs documenting the evidence specific to their jurisdiction, without reference to similar deaths in neighboring counties. The lack of coordination was partly bureaucratic inefficiency. The reality that law enforcement in antebellum Alabama operated on county level without centralized record-keeping that might reveal patterns across jurisdictions. But the failure to connect these deaths also reflected deliberate choice by the planter class, a collective decision to avoid acknowledging what the pattern suggested. To formally investigate the possibility that an enslaved man was killing his owners methodically, impossibly, without leaving evidence, would require admitting that their entire system of control was penetrable, that resistance could take forms they had not anticipated or prepared to counter. The foundation of plantation society rested on the maintained fiction of absolute white supremacy, the belief that enslaved people were inherently inferior, incapable of the intelligence and planning required for sophisticated resistance. To acknowledge that Gregg might be outsmarting the surveillance systems designed to contain him, that he might be executing murders that left trained law enforcement unable to explain the mechanics of death, would undermine the ideological justifications for slavery itself. So the deaths remained isolated incidents in official records. Tragic accidents, unfortunate coincidences, mysteries that reflected the limitations of medical knowledge rather than deliberate homicide. Plantation owners discussed the pattern in private correspondence, letters between trusted associates that acknowledged what public records could not. These letters reveal awareness that something extraordinary and terrifying was occurring, that Gregg represented a threat unlike any they had previously encountered. But even in private communication, planters struggled to articulate the nature of the threat beyond acknowledging the undeniable fact that owning Gregg seemed to carry fatal consequences. Some planters theorized that Gregg possessed unusual intelligence, that he was somehow engineering murders through methods that left no trace. Others suggested he might be working with accomplices, other enslaved people who executed the killings at his direction while his alibi remained ironclad. A few considered supernatural explanations, wondering privately if something about Gregg's extraordinary size indicated otherworldly nature, though these suggestions were usually dismissed as superstitious nonsense, unworthy of rational men. What none could explain was the specific mechanism of death, the locked rooms that should have been impenetrable, the absence of weapons or signs of struggle, the crushing force that suggested massive weight applied from above, yet left no indication of what object could produce such trauma. The pattern was clear. The method remained invisible. And Gregg, questioned after each death, maintained his silence, offering alibis that investigation always confirmed, watching his interrogators with eyes that suggested he understood exactly what they could not prove, exactly what protection that impossibility of proof provided him as he moved from owner to owner, waiting for the moment when each man would be alone and vulnerable and unaware of what was coming. The fourth owner and new methods. Thomas Brennan purchased Gregg in November 1849 from the estate liquidation following Harold Wicksworth's death. Brennan was 48 years old, owner of Riverside Plantation, a property of moderate size that produced adequate returns through cotton and tobacco cultivation. Unlike Thornton and Wicksworth, Brennan was aware of the previous deaths when he made his purchase. The pattern of dead owners was discussed openly at the estate sale, buyers weighing the risk against Gregg's obvious labor value. Most declined to bid, unwilling to accept what seemed like a curse attached to Gregg's ownership. But Brennan saw opportunity where others saw danger. Brennan believed he understood where his predecessors had failed. Thornton had relied too heavily on punishment and isolation, creating resentment that might motivate violence. Wicksworth had employed excessive surveillance and degradation, psychological warfare that might drive an enslaved person to desperate action. Both approaches, Brennan theorized, were fundamentally adversarial, creating the conditions for resistance by treating Gregg as perpetual threat rather than valuable property deserving proper management. Brennan proposed a different methodology: reward rather than punishment, incentive rather than degradation, the creation of conditions that would make Gregg invested in his own good behavior. At Riverside Plantation, Gregg received treatment unprecedented among enslaved people in that region. His cabin was rebuilt to accommodate his size, with doorways tall enough to enter standing upright and ceiling high enough to move comfortably inside. His food rations were increased to portions that actually satisfied his appetite rather than barely maintaining subsistence. His work hours were reduced compared to other field hands, and he was assigned tasks that utilized his strength without requiring the constant, awkward physical positions that previous owners had demanded. Brennan even provided Gregg with better clothing, garments actually cut to fit his proportions rather than the deliberately undersized items Wicksworth had forced him to wear. Brennan believed this comparative kindness would create loyalty, that Gregg would recognize his improved circumstances and respond with genuine obedience rather than the resentful compliance that surveillance and punishment produced. This belief reflected Brennan's fundamental misunderstanding of slavery's moral mathematics. Small mercies from one's captor do not erase the evil of captivity itself. Better food does not compensate for stolen freedom. A taller doorway does not transform imprisonment into acceptable condition. Brennan was still an owner, Gregg was still property, and no amount of relative kindness could alter that foundational injustice. The enslaved community at Riverside watched Brennan's experiment with knowing skepticism. They understood what Brennan could not grasp, that Gregg's compliance was not cooperation, that his seeming acceptance of improved conditions was not gratitude, that every appearance of submission was calculation rather than genuine change in his relationship to his enslavement. They gave Gregg respectful distance, recognizing in his patient observation the same quality that had marked his time at previous plantations. He was waiting, assessing, identifying vulnerabilities in Brennan's system, just as he had with Thornton and Wicksworth. Thomas Brennan died on August 3, 1850, in his locked bedroom, his skull crushed, his body discovered by his wife. Gregg's alibi verified by multiple witnesses who testified he had been in the fields throughout the day and locked in his cabin throughout the night. The investigation followed the now familiar pattern, documented evidence of impossible circumstances, no explanation for how the murder was accomplished, official verdict of death by misadventure. Brennan's experiment in kindness had failed as completely as Thornton's isolation and Wicksworth's degradation. Gregg remained unpunished, unsold, and waiting for his next owner. The moment of visibility. In July 1851, a traveling minister named Reverend Simon Coulter visited Riverside Plantation at the invitation of Thomas Brennan's widow, who sought spiritual counsel following her husband's death and the plantation's uncertain future. Reverend Coulter was 62 years old, a Methodist circuit rider who had spent 40 years traveling through Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, bringing religious instruction to isolated plantation communities. He had witnessed slavery in countless iterations, seen the full spectrum of how enslaved people were treated, developed what he considered a nuanced understanding of the institution's moral complexities. But what Reverend Coulter observed during his 3-day stay at Riverside challenged his understanding in ways that left him profoundly shaken. On the second evening of his visit, as the minister sat on the veranda with Mrs. Brennan discussing theological matters, he noticed Greg working in the plantation yard perhaps 50 feet from the main house. Greg was engaged in some routine task, carrying tools from one outbuilding to another, moving with deliberate efficiency that suggested the work required no conscious thought. His mind obviously occupied elsewhere. Reverend Coulter watched Greg for perhaps 5 minutes, and during those minutes experienced what he would later describe as epiphany, a moment of clarity that arrived with the force of divine revelation. He saw suddenly and completely that he was witnessing something biblical in its terrible justice. Greg moved with the patience of prophecy, the certainty of divine retribution delayed but never prevented. There was no anger in his bearing, no visible rage or desperation, only calculation performed with the steadiness of someone working through a plan whose completion was inevitable, whose success was assured by time and careful observation. The minister felt compelled to speak, to warn Mrs. Brennan that she should not keep this man on her property, that something about Greg suggested danger operating on time-scale humans struggled to perceive. But he remained silent, understanding that any warning he could articulate would sound like superstition rather than genuine insight. How could he explain what he had seen? That Greg's patience appeared supernatural? That his stillness suggested the calm of someone who knew exactly what would happen next? That watching him work felt like witnessing the hand of Old Testament God moving through human history toward judgment that no earthly power could prevent? That evening, Reverend Coulter wrote in his journal, "I watched this man and realized I was witnessing something that transcends the categories we use to understand slavery and resistance. He is not merely an enslaved person seeking freedom through violence. He is retribution given human form, moving with the patience of forces that operate beyond mortal timescales." I said nothing to Mrs. Brennan, but I knew with absolute certainty that whatever fate befell her husband was deserved, and that no power on earth could protect those who attempt to own this man. Reverend Coulter left Riverside Plantation the next morning, departing earlier than planned, despite Mrs. Brennan's invitation to extend his stay. He never returned to that region of Alabama, and when questioned years later about why he avoided certain plantations in his circuit riding, he would only say that some places held darkness that spiritual counsel could not address, that some injustices required correction beyond what prayer could accomplish. His journal, discovered after his death in 1869, contained only that single entry about Greg, followed by blank pages suggesting the minister could not find words adequate to explain what he had witnessed or understood during those 5 minutes watching a man work in the fading evening light. The locked bedroom and impossible physics. Thomas Brennan died on August 3, 1851, between the hours of 2 and 5 in the afternoon, a time frame established by witnesses who had seen him alive at 2 when he retired to his bedroom for his customary afternoon rest, and dead at 5 when his wife entered to wake him for supper. The circumstances of his death replicated the pattern that had claimed 3 previous owners with precision that suggested not coincidence, but deliberate repetition, as if someone was demonstrating that the method worked regardless of precautions taken against it. Brennan's bedroom was located on the 2nd floor of the main house, accessed by a staircase that provided the only route to the upper level. His wife had been downstairs throughout the afternoon, working on correspondence in the parlor positioned at the base of the stairs. She testified that no one had ascended or descended those stairs during the 3 hours her husband was alone in his bedroom. The household staff confirmed her testimony, stating that they had been performing duties that kept them in constant view of the staircase and that no one had used it after Brennan went upstairs at 2. The bedroom door was locked from inside when Mrs. Brennan knocked at 5 to wake her husband. The key remained in the interior lock mechanism, making it impossible for anyone to have locked the door from outside. The room's 2 windows were fastened from inside, their locks showing no signs of tampering or forced entry. Yet Brennan's body lay on his bed with his skull showing the characteristic crushing trauma that had marked the deaths of Thornton, Wixworth, and the previous Brennan. The pattern of fracture indicated force applied from directly above, massive compression that drove bone fragments into brain tissue and caused death through catastrophic trauma. The physician who examined Brennan's body struggled to explain the mechanics of the injury. The amount of force required to produce such fractures would necessitate either a fall from significant height or impact with heavy machinery. Yet Brennan had clearly been lying on his bed when injured, the mattress still bearing the depression where his body had rested. Nothing in the room was heavy enough to produce the observed trauma. The ceiling above the bed showed no cracks or stress marks that might indicate something had fallen through from the attic above. Sheriff Drummond, now investigating his 3rd such death, brought in a consulting engineer from Montgomery to assess the physical evidence. The engineer calculated that producing the fracture pattern observed in Brennan's skull would require approximately 800 pounds of force applied over an area of roughly 6 inches diameter, sustained long enough to overcome the structural integrity of cranial bone. This was not a sudden impact, but gradual compression. Pressure increased methodically until resistance collapsed. The engineer could identify no mechanism present in the locked bedroom capable of generating such force. Greg's alibi was again impeccable. He had been working in the distant tobacco fields throughout the afternoon, observed by 2 overseers and surrounded by other field hands who verified he never left their company. The distance between the tobacco fields and the main house was roughly 400 yards, making it physically impossible for Greg to have traveled to the bedroom, committed murder, and returned without his absence being noticed. Yet Sheriff Drummond wrote in his personal notes, "This Negro is responsible. I am certain of it with every instinct I possess, but I cannot conceive the method. The laws of physics seem to bend around him, allowing actions that should be impossible to accomplish." The gathering fear. By late 1851, plantation owners across eastern Alabama were discussing Greg through private correspondence that circulated among the planter class like intelligence reports warning of impending threat. These letters, several dozen of which have been preserved in private family collections, reveal a community grappling with terror they could neither fully articulate nor officially acknowledge. The writers understood that Greg was somehow killing his owners, that the pattern was too consistent to attribute to coincidence, but they could not explain the mechanism of death or identify actionable measures that might provide protection. One planter wrote to his brother in South Carolina, "We face something unprecedented. This Negro murders through means I cannot identify, leaving no evidence that courts can prosecute. He has been investigated after 4 separate deaths and never charged, because his alibis are ironclad, his behavior unremarkable, his method invisible. Yet every plantation owner who purchases him dies within 12 to 18 months, always with identical injuries, always in locked rooms, always without explanation. We are facing something that defies our understanding of what enslaved people are capable of planning and executing." The letters debated various courses of action, each proposal revealing the writer's desperation. Some advocated for Greg's immediate execution, on general principles, arguing that the pattern of dead owners justified killing him regardless of legal niceties. But others pointed out that executing enslaved people without trial violated even the minimal legal protections that Southern courts extended to human property, and that such action would expose the planter class to lawsuits from Greg's current owner seeking compensation for destroyed property. The law that protected slavery also created protections for individual enslaved people that could not be easily circumvented. Other planters suggested Greg should be sold west to Texas or south to the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana, regions where life expectancy for enslaved people was measured in years rather than decades, and where the horrific working conditions might kill Greg through normal exploitation before he could kill another owner. But this proposal faced the problem of Greg's reputation, which had spread beyond Alabama through planter networks. No one wanted to accept the liability of owning property that came with a documented history of dead previous owners, regardless of how attractive Greg's labor capacity might be in abstract terms. A few correspondents proposed a collective solution, that plantation owners should agree never to purchase Greg, effectively making him unsellable property that would remain with his current owner until natural death ended the threat. But this required coordination across county lines and trust among competitors who normally viewed each other with commercial suspicion. And it did nothing to protect Greg's current owner from the fate that had befallen his predecessors. The correspondence reveals that some planters understood the deeper implications of their predicament. One wrote with unusual insight, "We have built our society on the premise that enslaved people are inferior, incapable of the intelligence required for sophisticated resistance. But this man demonstrates capabilities that challenge that premise. He has outsmarted 4 plantation owners, multiple overseers, dozens of guards, and every law enforcement officer who has investigated these deaths. He has accomplished what should be impossible and left us with no recourse except to admit that our fundamental assumptions about Negro intelligence are wrong. But we cannot make that admission without undermining the moral justification for slavery itself, so we are trapped, unable to protect ourselves because protection requires acknowledging truths that would destroy the system we depend upon." The fifth owner's desperation. Marcus Delaney purchased Greg in November 1851 for $1,600, a price that reflected the steep discount applied to property that had become notorious throughout Alabama's planter community. Delaney was 54 years old, owner of a struggling plantation whose cotton yields had declined for 3 consecutive years due to soil depletion, pest infestation, and Delaney's own inadequate management. He was a desperate man whose financial survival depended on dramatically increasing production, who saw in Greg's strength and discounted price a final opportunity to salvage an enterprise sliding toward bankruptcy and foreclosure. Delaney was fully aware of the previous deaths when he made his purchase. The pattern of dead owners was now openly discussed. The circumstances documented in sufficient detail that buying Greg constituted conscious acceptance of mortal risk. But Delaney convinced himself that proper precautions would provide protection that previous owners had failed to implement. He would never allow Greg inside the main house. He would maintain constant armed surveillance. He would sleep with loaded firearms within reach and would instruct his wife to do likewise. These measures would prevent whatever had befallen Thornton, Wixworth, and the others. The reality of maintaining such security quickly revealed itself as unsustainable. The constant guards required payment that Delaney's finances could barely support. The prohibition on Greg entering the main house meant that certain tasks requiring strength could not be completed efficiently, forcing Delaney to hire additional labor at expense he could not afford. The weapons kept loaded throughout the house created danger of accidental discharge, particularly concerning given that Delaney had 3 young children whose curiosity about firearms exceeded their understanding of their lethal nature. Most significantly, the atmosphere of constant surveillance and paranoia reduced everyone's productivity. Field hands worked under the watchful eyes of armed overseers whose attention was divided between managing labor and monitoring Greg. Household staff performed their duties while remaining alert for any sign that Greg might be approaching the main house. Their focus fragmented between their assigned tasks and their role in the security system. Delaney himself struggled to manage the plantation's business while dedicating substantial mental energy to worrying about Greg's location, movements, and potential threat. The plantation descended into a paranoid paralysis where fear replaced productivity as the primary output. Cotton remained unpicked because guards were stationed to watch Greg rather than supervising harvest. Equipment repairs were delayed because the overseer was occupied with monitoring rather than managing. Delaney's wife complained that she felt imprisoned in her own home, unable to move freely without considering whether Greg might be nearby, unable to sleep without waking at every sound to verify that locks remained secure and weapons remained accessible. Greg himself seemed almost peripheral to the crisis consuming the plantation. He performed his assigned tasks with the methodical efficiency that had characterized his behavior at previous plantations. He followed instructions without apparent resistance. He maintained the patient silence that marked his interactions with white authority. He gave no indication of planning violence or posing threat. Yet his mere presence created such consuming fear that the plantation's normal operations disintegrated under the weight of precautions designed to prevent his violence. Marcus Delaney died on January 19, 1852, in broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses, while Greg was locked in a reinforced storage building 300 yards away. The impossibility of Greg's involvement could not have been clearer, yet every instinct insisted he was responsible. The pattern had held for a fifth time, and the method remained as invisible as it had been when Richard Thornton died in his locked study nearly 4 years earlier. The death that changed everything. Marcus Delaney died at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon of January 19, 1852, while inspecting cotton fields in the company of his head overseer and 6 field hands who were clearing debris in preparation for spring planting. Witnesses testified that Delaney had been walking along a furrow row, examining soil quality and discussing fertilization strategies with his overseer, when he suddenly collapsed. The overseer rushed to Delaney's side and found him convulsing, hands moving to his head as if trying to remove something invisible pressing down upon his skull. The convulsions lasted perhaps 20 seconds before Delaney went still, his body relaxing into death with terrible finality. The physician who examined Delaney's body found the crushing skull fractures that had become the signature of these deaths, the characteristic pattern of compression applied from above that drove bone fragments into brain tissue. But the circumstances of this death differed dramatically from all previous cases. Delaney had not died alone in a locked room. He had died in open field surrounded by witnesses. He had not been lying down but standing upright when whatever force killed him began its work. And most significantly, Greg's alibi was not merely solid but absolutely ironclad in ways that eliminated even theoretical possibility of his physical involvement. Greg had been locked in a reinforced storage building since dawn that morning, confined there as punishment for what Delaney claimed was insufficient deference the previous evening. The storage building was located roughly 300 yards from the cotton fields where Delaney died. Armed guards had been posted outside the only door, with additional guards stationed at the building's 2 windows, all of which were barred with iron grates that prevented exit. These guards provided testimony that no one entered or left the building from sunrise until Delaney's death was discovered. They had maintained visual contact with all possible exit points throughout the morning and early afternoon. Greg had been continuously visible through the barred windows, observed sitting on the floor of the storage building in plain sight of his guards. The physical impossibility of Greg's involvement could not be clearer. He had not been near Delaney when death occurred. He could not have traveled from the storage building to the cotton fields without passing multiple witnesses. He possessed no weapon that could produce the observed injuries at distance, yet the manner of death was identical to the 4 previous cases, suggesting the same perpetrator using the same method. For the first time, investigators faced undeniable proof that traditional explanations for these deaths were insufficient. Sheriff Drummond, now investigating his 5th such death, stood in the cotton field where Delaney had died and struggled to reconcile the evidence with any rational theory of murder. He examined the ground for unusual tracks or depressions. He questioned every witness multiple times, searching for inconsistencies in their testimony. He inspected the storage building where Greg had been confined, looking for secret passages or hidden mechanisms that might explain how Greg could project lethal force across 300 yards of open ground. He found nothing that provided explanation. The investigation file from Delaney's death, preserved in county archives, shows that Drummond documented 12 different theories attempting to explain the evidence. Greg had trained an animal to attack on command. Greg possessed Confederates who executed murders at his direction. Greg had somehow poisoned Delaney with a substance that mimicked crushing trauma. Greg wielded supernatural powers. Each theory was documented and then dismissed as either impossible, given the evidence, or insufficient to explain all the observed facts. The investigation concluded with no charges filed, no arrest made, and Drummond's official report stating simply that Marcus Delaney died of unknown causes, possibly seizure or apoplexy, despite physical evidence suggesting crushing trauma inconsistent with natural disease processes. The questions no one could answer. How does a man locked in a building 300 yards away kill someone surrounded by witnesses in broad daylight? This question consumed the investigation into Marcus Delaney's death, expanding into uncomfortable territory that challenged fundamental assumptions about physical reality. The evidence was clear and consistent. Greg had been continuously confined and observed during the hours surrounding Delaney's death. Multiple independent witnesses verified his location. Yet Delaney had died with injuries identical to those that had killed 4 previous owners under similarly impossible circumstances. The investigation expanded to consider possibilities beyond normal criminal methodology. Had Greg developed some previously unknown capacity to project force at distance? Medical consultation revealed no physiological mechanism that would permit such ability, no precedent in scientific literature for human beings generating lethal force without physical contact. Was Greg operating in collusion with other enslaved people who executed the murders at his direction? Investigation of the enslaved community at Delaney's plantation revealed no evidence of conspiracy, no suspicious communications or coordinated movements that might indicate multiple perpetrators working together. The most thorough theory involved examining the previous deaths for overlooked evidence that might explain the mechanics of murder. Investigators revisited the locked rooms where Thornton, Wixworth, and the earlier Brennan had died, searching for hidden passages, concealed mechanisms, anything that might explain how Greg could have entered secured spaces, committed murder, and departed without leaving trace. The examinations revealed nothing. The rooms were exactly as they appeared. Conventional spaces with standard locks, normal windows, no architectural features that would permit surreptitious entry or exit. A consulting physician proposed that the crushing trauma might result from some form of rapid-onset disease that mimicked the appearance of external force, perhaps an aneurysm or tumor that caused catastrophic intracranial pressure, creating fracture patterns that resembled compression from outside. But this theory failed to explain why such a rare condition would afflict 5 men in sequence, all of whom happened to own the same enslaved person, all of whom died within 12 to 18 months of acquiring Greg. The statistical improbability rendered the natural disease explanation less credible than supernatural alternatives. Some investigators began seriously entertaining possibilities that defied materialist understanding of reality. Was Greg possessed of demonic forces? Did his unusual size indicate supernatural nature? Had he somehow acquired occult knowledge that permitted killing through ritual or curse? These suggestions were usually dismissed as superstitious nonsense, unworthy of rational inquiry. But they kept resurfacing in private conversations among investigators who could find no natural explanation for the pattern of deaths they were tasked with solving. The investigation file grew to encompass hundreds of pages of testimony, physical evidence, medical consultation, and theoretical speculation. Yet for all this documentation, the fundamental question remained unanswered. How had Greg killed 5 men under circumstances that should have made murder impossible? The pattern was undeniable. The method was invisible. And Greg himself, questioned extensively after each death, maintained his patient silence, offering minimal responses that provided no useful information, watching his interrogators with eyes that suggested he understood exactly what they could not prove, exactly what protection that impossibility of proof provided him. The investigation into Delaney's death officially closed in March 1852 with no resolution, no charges filed, and no satisfactory explanation for how a locked man had killed someone 300 yards away in broad daylight surrounded by witnesses. Sheriff Drummond's final report noted that the investigation had exhausted all reasonable lines of inquiry without identifying actionable evidence supporting criminal charges. Greg remained legally innocent, his involvement proven impossible by the very thoroughness of the investigation designed to establish his guilt. The disappearance and the silence that followed. In March 1852, while being transported to a new owner in Georgia, Greg disappeared under circumstances that added final mystery to a story already saturated with impossible events. The 3 armed men escorting him reported stopping at a stream approximately 40 miles east of Montgomery to water their horses and allow their prisoner brief rest after hours of travel. Greg, who had been walking behind the mounted guards with his hands bound, asked permission to drink from the stream. The request seemed reasonable given the afternoon heat and the distance they had traveled. The lead escort granted permission, instructing Greg to kneel by the water while maintaining careful watch on him. 2 guards kept their rifles trained on Greg while the 3rd watered the horses several yards upstream. Greg knelt at the water's edge, massive frame folding into the posture his escorts required, and drank with his bound hands cupped to lift water to his mouth. The escort later testified that he watched Greg drink for perhaps 15 seconds before turning his head briefly to call instructions to the man watering the horses regarding their next stop. When the lead escort turned back to Greg, perhaps 3 seconds after looking away, Greg was gone. Simply vanished from the stream bank without sound or indication of movement. The escort reported experiencing momentary confusion, his mind struggling to process the absence where a 7-foot man had knelt moments before. He searched the immediate area, calling to the other guards who rushed to the scene. All 3 men scanned the surrounding landscape, looking for a figure too large to hide, too distinctive to blend into the Alabama wilderness. They found nothing. No tracks leading away from the stream. No broken vegetation indicating flight through the underbrush. No indication of direction or method of departure. A man weighing over 300 pounds and standing 7 feet tall had somehow left the immediate area without disturbing the soft mud at the stream's edge, without creating noise that would alert guards mere yards away, without being spotted crossing open ground visible in multiple directions. The escort searched for hours, expanding their perimeter as daylight faded, finding no trace of Greg's passage. The search continued for 3 days, involving dozens of men and tracking dogs that should have easily followed the scent of someone Greg's size. The dogs found nothing, showing confusion at the stream bank as if Greg's scent simply terminated at the water's edge without continuing in any direction. Some searchers theorized that Greg had entered the stream and traveled downstream to disguise his trail, but this would require him to move through water while evading searchers on both banks, and the stream was shallow enough that a man of Greg's height would be easily visible even if walking through the current. The Alabama Planters Association discussed Greg's disappearance in their closed session 1 month later. The meeting minutes, discovered in 2019, reveal unanimous decision that the matter would not be publicized beyond what was necessary for legal purposes. No reward would be offered for Greg's capture or information about his whereabouts. Any future claims about a 7-foot enslaved man killing his owners would be dismissed as rumor and superstition. The association members voted to treat Greg's story as closed, his disappearance marking the end of an episode they preferred to forget rather than understand. This silence held for over 170 years. No newspaper articles documented the pattern of deaths. No historical accounts mentioned Greg by name. The story survived only in private family correspondence and sealed county records, fragments that suggested horrors the official history chose not to preserve. To this day, no grave has been found bearing Greg's name, no record confirms his death, no document explains where he went after vanishing by that Alabama stream. The questions remain suspended in the silence of incomplete history, mysteries that challenge our understanding of what resistance looked like, what justice meant, and what became of the man called Greg, who disappeared into legend carrying secrets that authorities could neither solve nor acknowledge.